starts, as I explained earlier, that we are trying to diversify topics. And earlier we talked about psychiatric cases with one of the doctors in Pakistan. Now we are going to discuss something in Africa, which is one of the most important continents in the world. And it has a rich history, and one of the biggest countries of Africa, or rather the biggest, I think, in terms of population, Nigeria. We have a guest from there. We call him Chisodi, but I would like him to introduce himself in a few lines, and then we will ask about Nigeria. So, what's your complete name and what you do?
Okay, thank you for having me. My name is Chidozie Obiabumo, and I'm an engineer by academic study, and also a practicing engineer, mechanical engineer. Um, so that's basically what I do. So we can go ahead and ask you questions.
So, Chisodi is also a graduate of Teesside University in the UK. The first question, that a brief history of Nigeria. What is the history of Nigeria and its ethnic composition?
Okay, so Nigeria is the largest, quite most populated country in Africa, with about 214 million people in population. Um, Nigeria is about 60, they're about 63 years old, 64 years old right now. Um, and Nigeria is basically made up of three major ethnic groups: the Igbo, Hausa, and the Yorubas, and also made up of some minority groups, which are other little minority ethnic groups, which are about 300 and something, about 315 other ethnic groups. Nigeria is a challenged country um, in terms of political corruption, in terms of bad governance, in terms of terrorism, in terms of economic and economic issues, inflation, um, poverty. So Nigeria has been challenged with a lot of issues, and right now the political situation in Nigeria is we having to vote in leaders that are promising to revamp this economy. Currently, Nigeria is challenged with kidnapping, banditry, terrorism, um, bad economy, which we have a current president right now, Tinubu, which obviously he has been trying his best to combat the issues as best as he can. Though there've been a lot of criticism regarding his policies. One of his major policies he put in place when he came into the office was the trying to unification of the naira, the currencies, and he also put in another reform, which is a tax reform, which he put into the country. These two reforms were heavily criticized by Nigerians because after um, he came into governance, into power, and removed the fuel subsidy, because Nigeria was predominantly have our subsidies, our fuels are being subsidized, And when he came into power, there was a whole saying and propaganda saying, "Oh, this is criminal. Fuel subsidy is criminality in Nigeria. Is a criminal enterprise. We do not want subsidy anymore." So on his first day of inauguration, he said no more subsidy. He canceled subsidy, and when he did that, a lot of the prices of things, a lot of commodities began to skyrocket in price. There was a very huge inflation in the market. Um, compound, especially with the compound effect of trying to unify the naira, and so the people have always have been challenged with these issues in terms of doing businesses, running small scale businesses, the SMEs and small businesses like that. There've been a lot of challenges, and so therefore he has been heavily criticized. And that's just about the economy. And another very big issue is the issue of insecurity, where we have banditry, kidnapping, terrorism going down happening in the north. Um, and it's one of the biggest crises happening in Nigeria right now. where people school children are being kidnapped in the schools, where people students can't go to school anymore. You see people can't attend religious gatherings. You see farmers can't go to their farms because of the risk of being killed and of being killed or being maimed on their farmlands by either bandits or people who are grazing, the herdsmen who are grazing. There's always a frequent clash between farmers and herdsmen in Nigeria. So these are little issues that predominantly always causes insecurity in Nigeria, along with everything that's happening. And one other thing again is that Nigeria is heavily dependent on our oil, and that was why when the issue of having to remove the fuel subsidy was a very big issue, because it sort of cut out a lot of people who are benefiting from those subsidy, and then when two elephants fight, the grass suffers, and what happens was that a lot of prices of fuel went up, and everything started going up, and people have been heavily criticized. Though in Nigeria, the people have a favorite, which is predominantly a man they call Peter Obi, which people believe is supposed to help, revamp the economy, save more money, and bring people out of this, situation where they're currently in. Um, there have been a lot of revolutionary movements trying to go on in Nigeria, which has been highly condemned by the Nigerian government. We have some prominent activists like Omole Showore, um, who has been an activist for the longest in Nigeria, advocating for a revolution, which he believes that Nigeria can only be saved by a total, revolution of the country and the removal of the people in the government and these policies. So Nigeria, there's this huge, polarization going on in the Nigerian political space, where you have a lot of factions, a lot of groups, a lot of things happening all at once, right? At the same time, you have people who are trying to do their best, people who are trying to resist the governance, people who are just frustrated at their current situation. Um, and they have other challenges like the healthcare, the corruption that's going on, the schools, the bad roads. So there are a lot of things going on in Nigeria. And I think
So, uh, sorry, let's talk about religious composition. You did talk about ethnic composition. What is the religious composition, and is there any tension between Christians and Muslim, or is there any ethnic tensions between different ethnic groups?
okay. Yes, there have been religious and especially religious tensions and ethnic tensions. If I should say something that currently happened, recently, just before I came to your show, I was reading a news where a man was killed by Metiala. Um, Metiala is a small group of people from a place two people from a place called Jos, Benue, sorry, Benue, and and another people who are probably the Fulani headsmen. You understand? And they've been in this clash because of the Fulani are predominantly grazers with their cows, and people who are from Benue are farmers. So recently I was reading the news where one person was killed, and there was rumors that a very big clash is about to happen between them. So there've always been these issues happening in different places. Sometimes you have this issue happening in Jos. Sometimes you have it happening in somewhere called Benue. You know, sometimes you have it in some other region in Nigeria. You understand? And about the religious composition, Nigeria is predominantly split into um, two major religion, which is Muslims and Christians. And to some extent, we have sort of lived in peace, but there have been tensions. There have been tensions, especially one time during the election, where, especially during this last election, which brought in the last president, there was a lot of criticism because he picked a Muslim ticket where the president and the vice president were both Muslims. So this caused a lot of division and uproar among a lot of Nigerians, where they believe that doesn't sort of represent a nationalistic view of Nigeria, where you have two major ethnic group. They believe in, if a president comes is a Muslim, then the vice president should be Christian. If the vice president is Christian, then the president should be Muslim. So that's sort of how they've sort of tried to balance this situation. And also politically, the way they also try to balance the issue of ethnicity, especially when it comes to power and governance, is that they said, okay, Nigeria has the North and the South. So they say, okay, after the South rules, the North will rule. So we have this unspoken, law that everyone understands when it comes to sharing of power, when it comes to how things are being done, especially when it comes to appointments, where you try to create this balance, and make sure everyone sort of has, a sort of like, representative in power and in governance. So anytime this representation is not going exactly the way the people believe it should be, just like when I talked about the Muslim tickets, it always causes a lot of ethnic tension. And to also talk about a lot of ethnic tension going on is the issue that's happening in the north. Sorry, a religious tension is the issue happening in the north with the Boko Haram. You know, there's been a lot of issues where people were killed in churches. There are a lot of reports where people were killed in churches, where you have people, armed men going to churches and kill, or you have leaders or in churches being abducted, being kidnapped and then killed. So they have been tensions, religious tensions, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, which there is a
So
lot of.
Muslim have Boko Haram. Is there also any Christian militant wing or terrorist wing
Um,
that is
there,
countering Boko Haram?
no, I do not know. I do not know of any Christian military group. I only know that in the eastern part of Nigeria, there have been a group that was somehow almost like a terrorist group called the unknown gunmen, and in the east they are predominantly Christians. Eastern part of Nigeria, they're mostly Christians there, and the unknown gunmen, which sort of was happening around that part. So is that what? But they didn't pose themselves as any religious. They just pose themselves as more of a political and just doing something here. It wasn't a religious issue. So I do not know about any Christian military or stuff like that going on. But I know
Okay,
about.
my last question. Yeah, Jizodi, my last question is that recently there have been changes in Africa, especially it is believed that if Ibrahim Todo is very popular among young Africans. There have been a few military coups, and it is believed that anti-France emotions or feelings are running high. So, how do you see these military coups, and why do you think that anti-France feelings or emotions are running high?
Okay. What I think about what I know regarding sorry, what I know regarding military coup is because I know that recently the Nigerian government released a statement saying that they stopped a military coup from happening. Recently, they said a military coup was about to happen and some officials were being taken into custody, about plotting a military coup in Nigeria. And the issue of Traore. Yeah, Traore is a sort of like a revolutionary leader, with the way he's sort of transforming, Burkina Faso, and a lot of people, he's been praised publicly, and even in Nigeria, a lot of Nigerians sort of, you know, align with what he's doing. They sort of see it as something that, or some people even say, oh, isn't it better if we have a military leader, just because of the fact that they see, a betterment or a good thing coming out of what Traore, is doing. You understand how he's able to get his people, put a lot of economic things in place. There's a lot of infrastructure going on in Burkina Faso. So this sort of like make people attracted to what he's doing, as a sign of very goodwill and a sign of very good governance. So yes, he's popular among a couple of Nigerians, especially among the youth, where people see him as a very good leader, a very promising leader. of which we've also had some protests where you had in Nigeria, where you have people marching to to the military camps, going to go and protest. Recently, there was a little protest in Nigeria where Nigerians went to the military camp and there was a protest about the killing and the kidnappings. You understand? So, yes, there've always been this relationship between the Nigerians and the military, especially when it comes to, to power. You understand? There've been this understanding because obviously Nigeria came from a military regime before we went into, a democratic, you understand? So, and then we've had past military leaders, um, and we've had one of our prominent military leader, which is Obasanjo, which ruled I think from 1999 to about 2007. And then we had another one, General Buhari, who just died, I think, not quite too long. He was also a military leader, which also came back and ruled as a democratic leader. So Nigerians have always, had this relationship or understood them having people who have come from the ex-military, and you understand. So when the issue of Traore, comes up, it's something that they are easily drawn to. It's not something that they do not know about. It's something that they are used to. You understand? That is why his influence could easily, go into, Nigerians and among the youth to say, okay, if we have someone who is young, someone who is promising, someone who is doing the right thing, isn't it better than the what we are facing right now, the economic, the corruption and everything that is going on? Um, but it, that idea is still debatable because a lot of people still believe that democracy is way more better than being in a military military governance. And so you have people saying, okay, no, it's going to be a dictatorship, and you have some people saying, oh, isn't it better where you understand? So there's a lot of you know mixed signal when it comes to
So,
that. Yeah,
so can would it be fair to say that Ibrahim Toro, if I can correctly pronounce his
yeah,
name,
Traore.
he's not only popular among the Nigerian youth, but he's popular among youth in several parts of Africa. Would it be fair? Would it be a fair assessment?
Yes, yes, yes. Traore is quite popular around Africa in general. Yes, he is. Because why is it that popular? Because a lot of African countries are challenged in one way or the other, especially when it comes to economic challenges, when it comes to either poverty, when it comes to issues. So yes, Traore, it's very easy for someone like Traore to gain a lot of influence around Africa when he is seen as a leader who is doing something and leading his country, in a promising direction. So yes, he has some level of influence among other countries, apart from Nigeria, which we have people saying, oh yeah, I like his what he's doing, I like the way he's leading the country, I like what he's doing. Yes, it's a fair statement.
So, do these military coups suggest that the influence of France is declining, especially in former French colonies or in Africa in general?
Um, if their influence is declining, I amongst the people, yes, I could say that. But amongst the government, geopolitics is a whole different thing. Which is a lot more different when than just what the people actually think. I don't know if you get what I mean by that. So yes, amongst the people, a lot of people, like the ordinary people, ordinary citizens, yes, they do not feel any sort of, they might not feel any sort of, attachment to, some sort of like France and their influence diminishing and that kind of thing. But I do know that there's obviously been a kickback from France regarding a lot of things, especially regarding Traore. Also in our own president Tinubu, I know that there have been one or two sort of like issues when it comes to the position of Traore. You understand? Because Traore's position in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso and in Africa is still being debatable to an extent. Where you have some leaders who are still more, in line with the France government, standing with them and saying, oh, probably Traore is an illegitimate leader. He's illegitimate, and you understand. And you have some people still, being in on his side. You understand? So it's not sort of like something that is it's not quite of straight. It's not quite straightforward to just say, okay, their influence is being diminished in total. You understand? But yes, it's debatable. You understand? Yes, there's a gray area there. Yeah, there's a gray area there, especially when you have someone who is like Traore, who is standing his ground, doing what he has to do. So obviously, with the likes of him in that position, there's obviously an issue when it comes to the influence of any sort of like colonial thing going on there, and obviously he's not sort of like representing the whole huge capitalist, yeah. So
Okay, Chizodi, thank you very much. We shall come with more episodes on in Africa. Thanks for sparing time and joining us. And we shall, inshallah, contact you again in the future.
all
Thank you
right,
very
thank you
much.
so much.